Good morning. All right. Good morning. Welcome to the plenary session 3 of the 14th DLSU Arts Congress with the theme Pandemic, Resilience, and Arts. Now, this Arts Congress was brought to you by the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, Office of Assistant Dean for Research and Advanced Studies, College of Liberal Arts, the Museum, the Culture and Arts Office, in cooperation with the CLA Graduate Student Council. Now, this morning's plenary session is entitled Arts and Humanities Amid Viral and Virulent Times. Now, I am Mr. Marquinha Albalala from the Communication Department, your co-host for this plenary session. Now, before we formally begin today, kindly keep in mind the following reminders for our Zoom participants. Hello? All right, so to prevent internet connection traffic, we request our dear audience to please keep microphones and video cameras off during the session. Now, for our question and answer portion later, we shall be using Slido by either scanning the code, okay, here, looking at a slide here, you may use the QR code, okay, flash on screen, or by clicking the Slido link provided in the Zoom chat box. No, our faculty moderator later will be the one to read for us the questions for the audience. Now, before we start our session, let us have first our prayer. Can we lessen the sounds first? Thank you so much. Now let us put ourselves in the presence of God. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear God, thank you for all the blessing you have bestowed upon us. We are truly grateful for them. Thank you for allowing us today to meet and share our knowledge and time with one another in this seminar and plenary. May you extend your divine wisdom to our speakers so that they would be able to impart effectively His God-given knowledge to all of us. May they be blessed as they continue to bring their expertise to people who need them. Bless the participants as well so that they would be able to glean the vital information from this activity. May you bestow your blessings after the seminar so that we may go out and spread what we learn in the spirit of your love and generosity. May we realize that this activity should glorify your name. Our Lasallian prayer, I will continue, oh my God, to do all my actions for the love of you. Saint John Baptist de la Salle, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, amen. There. Thank you so much. Now, I am sure that we are all excited, for this plenary. Now, we shall now begin this morning's plenary session. And to moderate our session, may I introduce the moderator for this plenary. Now, he is a professor of literature and cultural studies at De La Salle University. His research interests include critical theory, cultural studies, Southeast Asian studies, and migration and diaspora studies. He has published widely on gender and transnationalism in international peer-reviewed journals and his monograph, Narratives, Affect, and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration was published by Routledge in 2021. Now, he also finished rather his PhD degree in comparative literature at the University of Hong Kong and his MA degree in critical and cultural theory at Cardiff University, United Kingdom, where he was a Ford Foundation International Fellow from 2009 to 2011. Let us all welcome from the Department of Literature, Dr. Carlos M. Piocos III. Doctor?
Good morning, everyone. So today, what we are going to reflect on this panel is the state of arts and humanities research in the time of pandemic. So thank you very much, Reniel, for by the way, for that generous introduction. So what our roundtable discussion would do is basically discuss how literary, art, and cultural scholars, number one, think through critical theory and the various crises of populism exacerbated by pandemic inequalities and precarities. So, what is the role of theory in during this pandemic? Then reflect on cultural studies methodologies and sort of the kind of research that also respond to on the ground realities of grounded flights, quarantines, physical distancing, and intensified vulnerability. So for cultural scholars, what does it mean to do research during the time of pandemic? And strategized pedagogies, and scholarly explorations of art in the time of social isolation. So, for teachers and scholars of art, how do we understand or how do we teach and do research in the time of pandemic? And then, in queer and disrupt the straight new normal through the radical politics of gender and sexuality in studies of popular culture. So our panel will start with Dr. Antonette Arogo or Tiny. Dr. Tiny is holds a PhD literature degree in De La Salle University, where she teaches literature, theory, and criticism, and cultural studies. She was a participant in the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell University in 2009, and her research interests also include continental philosophy and translation studies. She's currently working on her book on cosmopolitanism in contemporary Philippine critical theory. She will be presenting on the function of theory at the present time. This presentation talks about the role of theory in this ever-changing and fragile period, something that we have been experiencing since 2016, way before the pandemic, and how does it dovetail into and what are its implications of all of this politics of affect and anger up to this point in our time where we are still isolated inside our. So without further ado, Tiny, you can you can take on the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piocos. Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be a part of this plenary with my colleagues from the Literature Department, Dr. Carlos Piocos, Dr. Francis Sangil, and Dr. Johan Espiritu. Thank you to the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, the College of Liberal Arts, especially Dr. Dennis Trinidad, Chair of the Arts Congress and Assistant Dean for Research and Advanced Studies, and all involved in putting together this year's event. As mentioned, the title of my short talk is The Function of Theory at the Present Time. When the British poet, critic, and educator Matthew Arnold wrote The Function of Criticism at the Present Time in 1865, he was writing within a temporal horizon of skepticism of religion, particularly created by the theory of evolution of Charles Darwin, the fourth hermeneut of suspicion, according to Paul Ricoeur, Paul Fry, along with Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. This was also a period of unrest in England among the working class and the poor who were fighting for their right to vote. Arnold's concern was the role of literary interpretation in the education of the lower classes, the next generation of significant political actors. His well-known and oft-cited definition of criticism as the disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world did not read literary studies of its social function. Rather, he viewed the best literature, what he called touchstones, as a means for spiritual and social renewal through character development that cultivated, to borrow the succinct phrasing of the editors of the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, quote, a sharp yet supple movement of mind, a vigilant guard against an excess of commitment to a single point of view, and a refusal to accept the alluring power of extreme polarizing judgments, unquote. Notwithstanding the critiques of Arnoldian disinterestedness, the complicity with state power and cultural capital, as well as literary instrumentalism, this ideal of deliberate reflection on the self and society and non-rigid thinking in what he believes to be the function of criticism must not be overlooked. Any argument for the necessity of theory at the present time must contend with similar questions arising from the context of production and reception. What constitutes the temporal horizon of the present, and how might we understand crisis as the defining affect of our sense of the now? Laurent Berlant defines the historical present as, quote, that which has made itself present as a situation of crisis that simultaneously individuates and collectivizes, shapes appetites and imaginaries, and induces activities from scavenging what is going on, where's that feeling of loss and where's that feeling of potential coming from, to world making, what is there to hold me in the world, unquote. Crisis is an experience of disturbance in forms of life and their reproduction, in which subjects, having been ineluctably ascribed identities not of their own making, live with other subjects and develop attachments understood through discourses of collective existence, like belonging, or Berlant's preferred idiom, being with. In a crisis, these attachments that anchor the continuity of the everyday are revealed as fantasies in which we have lost faith, unsettling our assurance in a life worth living. For Berlant, when the fantasy of the good life can no longer be tethered to norms of nattering and flourishing, precarity ensues. Etymologically, crisis from the Greek krisis means to distinguish, to separate, to judge. Tying crisis to criticism and critique, also defined as the selection of texts to be preserved through canon formation, are the elements of discernment and decision making. Ramon Reyes, speaking in 1984 Philippines, notes, quote, in history, we see that moments of human crisis are also often watersheds of critical philosophical reflection. For at such moments, man is driven back by the force of circumstances to struggle with himself, to return on his most fundamental positions regarding the ground and sense of his existence, unquote. What happens when that very ground loses solidity and ceases to be reliable? The pandemic has generated a sense of shared historical present and a feeling of precariousness, the affective register of crisis, across various locales with their own modes of social and economic organization and ways of adaptation to local flows. This is both individual and social precariousness. Judith Butler explains how we are precarious because we are bodies moving in this world, bodies made of porous skin that are injurable and, as COVID-19 unforgivingly exposes, susceptible to viruses. Other than this individualism at the existential level of precariousness, there is importantly its social aspect. We are precarious when infrastructures to address needs and that support forms of life are lost and become unreliable. According to Butler, quote, precarity exposes our sociality, the fragile and necessary dimensions of our interdependency, unquote. Although vicariousness is a common condition, it is unevenly distributed and dependent on norms of recognition. Who is deserving of care and who is disposable, replaceable, or exchangeable? Whose life is grievable and whose life is less so, which is really to ask who is human or less human or non-human. An ethical disposition and relation that proceeds from precarity cannot be a return to anthropocentrism, Butler asserts, but must recognize the reciprocity between the human and the non-human in sustaining life, a revaluation aligned with movements for a non-violent relation with the other, defined by or identified with minoritized categories of identity that have been studied under the banner of, after Lila Gandhi, affective communities. Indeed, the politics of identity has contributed to that sense of a collective time, evidenced by, say, the Black Lives Matter protests held outside of the United States, including France, where significantly identity politics, especially post colonialism, is being seen by members of the government as posing a threat to French national culture and identity. Pervading assemblies of precarious bodies, without discounting that there are different kinds of assemblies, is anger. This anger-driven performance of a collective, a bringing about of a we insisting on their theirs or indispensability, is enacted across various spaces such as social media and the theater stage. As I have written about, and allow me to read excerpts from my published work, the staging of RD 3RD is a paradigmatic example, a play adapted from Shakespeare's Richard III, contextualized in the Philippine government's war on drugs, and directed by Anton Juan and Ricardo Abad at the Yuchenko Auditorium de La Salle University in June 2018. In this adaptation, Richard III is crowned king, whereas in the original, he is killed by the Earl of Richmond, who assumes the throne as King Henry VII. At the moment of Richard III's coronation, the fourth wall rather was broken, and the spectators enjoined to choose one among three courses of action: stay silent, affirm the king's authority by cheering him on, or reverberantly decry his evil deeds by shouting no. Overwhelmingly, the audience condemned the titular character. In a powerful cathartic moment, they did not just shout no. They stood up, they pointed at, they cursed back at the leader who curses. They were angry and able to perform their anger. Theater affected the audience, and in the state of affectation, of being affected by, is the potential for action, of affecting that which makes us political, according to Hannah Arendt. Is anger an effective resource in social and political change? Put another way, and drawing from affect theory, is anger positive, increasing the potential for action or agency? Or is it negative, an ugly feeling that diminishes agency? The question is not what anger is, but what does anger do? The audience's no is a performative utterance in that it is a reclamation of agency, a taking control of a complex social and political problem enabled by the release of the emotion of anger. It is an objection to the leadership and a rejection of the state of the nation. And it is also a permission of affective solidarity and expressive of the audience's commitment to take this engagement beyond the theater, to do something else or something more. Ideally, the play facilitates collective action oriented toward future good, what Martha Nussbaum calls transition anger. But it can just as easily provoke desire for revenge. In other words, anger can be constructive or counterproductive. The former is teleological, while the latter is vindictive and in line with negative reinforcement. Nussbaum advances a philosophical account of anger that departs from the Aristotelian framework of downranking and payback, and to which he proposes unconditional love as an alternative. To Nussbaum, Aristotelian anger is centered on the perspective of the aggrieved, the angry person, against whom or against one circle of concern an intentionally wrongful act was committed, resulting in the individual's diminishing of status. What ameliorates the pain of offense is the possibility of retribution. The philosophical tradition has inherited this notion of anger as constituted by the wish for the suffering of the offender. But as Nussbaum argues, this does not restore what was lost or damaged. The rational course of action focuses on deterrence rather than retaliation and promotes social welfare specific to the context, enabling a transition from anger to compassionate hope. a movement of mind that sees the effective way of attaining justice is through reconciliation and cooperation. Anger is useful as a signal that a wrongdoing was committed. It is also a way of raising awareness of personal values presumably violated by the wrongful act. In both cases, anger motivates people to action toward improving their situation, the goal of transition. Without this future orientedness, anger devolves into irrationality and destructiveness. Nussbaum also distinguishes anger from contempt that arises from a moral evaluation of a person's character that does not meet the normative ideal and so incurs reprobation, more so if that person occupies public office. We can understand President Rodrigo Duterte's political style, his way of addressing the people especially, as performative populism, in which, as Benjamin Moffat explains, quote, the leader is seen as the performer, the people as the audience, and crisis and media as the stage on which populism plays out upon, unquote. The same interpretative lens can be used to understand Trump's ascent to power. Contempt, as Nussbaum sees it, is not associated with action tendency, while anger moves forward in the interest of protecting individual and social goods, such as helping those suffering and working with institutions to bring about change. If anger is valuable, a question that necessarily follows is whose anger rather is honorable or whose anger is legitimate. Undeniably, there is a valuation of anger along gender lines. Men, as rational beings in conformance with masculinity, are supposed to desire and exact revenge for a wrongdoing against them, but they will be able to transition, as opposed to women who are supposed to be excessively emotional and so narcissistically remain focused on the slighting and remain vindictive. To quote Nussbaum, these gender norms, which connect anger to power and authority, womanly non-anger to weakness and dependency, make many women think that they need to school themselves in anger to right the balance and assume their full equality as agents, unquote. Within this context can be understood the stereotypical and negative perception of feminists as angry and without a sense of humor. Nussbaum invites us to see how the orientation to anger in feminism can in itself be culturally constructed, revealing of women's helplessness born of what has been scripted for them to believe should be within their control. She recuperates non-anger and relatedly interdependence and reciprocity as strong for men and women, tied to how she explains transition as a movement toward rectification and reparation rather than retribution. This is, of course, a valid point, but can we also argue that feminist anger takes the form of transition anger to which we can attribute the rights that have been secured for women throughout history? This latter view is a resistance to patriarchy's domestication of female anger as simply unruly and antagonistic, and an insistence on the role of female anger in the advancements of women's movements, indeed of other protest movements as demonstrated by what is happening in Myanmar, where women embracing a variety of affects from maternal care, that is, to hatred of oppression, and bravely risking precariousness are on the front lines of protests. These days, it must be acknowledged everyone is angry. Feminists are angry, human rights activists are angry, the LGBTQ plus community is angry, students are angry, environmentalists are angry, people of color are angry, populists are angry. Relatedly, Guy Standing writes of what he calls the precariat class, quote, they are floating, rudderless, and potentially angry, capable of veering to the extreme right or left politically and backing populist demagoguery that plays on their fears or phobias, unquote. When the phrase culture of incivility is invoked to describe what's taking place in social media, on the streets, at universities, in theaters, we think of opposition turned hostility, of difference turned detestation. With mediatized public spheres being affect worlds according to Virulent, that have become more plebeian and transnational, are pathos-driven publics and counter-publics a symptom of the degeneration of the quality of discourse, Or can anger that is transition anger be a condition of possibility of genuine, respectful, and reciprocal communication? To publicize anger is essential in combating injustices and a rightful assertion of self and collective respect. Following Nussbaum, it has to transition to a forgiving and reconciling mode of relationality. One step in this direction is to allow, rather than disallow, communication or recognition, the important element to which is purposiveness. As with RD3RD, to affect the audience is a necessary starting point. Their anger is an awakening to injustices and a means for the evocation of sympathetic understanding. Yet it cannot end with the display of anger at the performance's end, with shouting and heckling and cursing at the target. Anger must transition to action, and as with any action, the question is its effects or consequences. Literature must not only move us to think and feel about the world, particularly one in simultaneous crisis as the world at present. Indeed, as had been adjured, it must change it. One way of doing so is by changing spectators as quote, co-participants in the passages of affect, unquote, who, through the text's evocation of a response, in turn respond to their world. In these viral and certainly virulent times, I take the function of theory to be, roughly sketched, a thinking through our encounters with others and objects in the world, and an imagining of the range of possible movements enabled by these affective relations. How I understand, rather, world making in Berlant's framework. It induces a reorientation toward time and publicness. The genre of world making and its relation to temporality is especially significant in the global south, long subjected to what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the monoculture of linear time, and charged with belatedness relative to Western modernity. That follows the imperative of acceleration. The so-called culture of speed and speed of culture form the ground of human life in late capitalism, including thinking and feeling. This manifests in everyday experiences of personal and political commentary and communication through social media, and professional advancement through higher productivity and associated with this labor flexibility. In Kate Zambrano's novel titled Drifts, which can be interpreted as a work of auto theory, the narrator writes in what reads as the writer's journal entry, quote, "Art is time," Anna writes me, a novel especially. "It must be slow. It must take the time it needs." All that summer, I attempt time. I try not to let the days bleed. I attempt to be in the room, outside of the internet. That summer, along with my daily black journals that accumulate in rows like gravestones, I begin keeping a notebook that I think of as the Drifts notebook, its cover a canary yellow that matches my copy of Walser's The Planners, which I read in short increments each season, never finishing, unquote. So is theory. Theory is time. It must be slow. It must take the time it needs. This is not to deny the democratizing and creative possibilities of immediacy and the media technologies that incorporate and facilitate this space, the cultural significance of speed in John Tomlin's words. Daniel Kahneman provides the analytic model for fast thinking and slow thinking, System 1 and System 2 respectively, and argues for the value of each in specific contexts. The critical reflection on slowness or the slow movement is gaining ground in theory through works like Rob Nixon's study of slow and non-spectacularized violence in environmental injustice. This can be understood in terms of the injunction to historicize, to reframe the cult of the moment as accretion of moments. Theory at the present time, by what I would like to call an affected individual, is an opening to these heterogeneous temporalities or heterotemporalities in Dipesh Chakraborty's formulation. In turn, an opening to heteroaffects, heteropublics, and importantly, heterogeneous futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiny, for that wonderful presentation. So, wala na. Okay na. Sarado. No, I'm just joking. So, thank you very much, Tiny, for that wonderful presentation, as I've said earlier. And I guess what I'm going to talk about today is a continuation of some of the points that you've highlighted, um, specifically in terms of how we proceed from critical theory in a time of crisis. And but I'll be coming from a very different perspective. I'm coming from the perspective of cultural studies. So I reformulated the question a little bit differently by thinking through our panel via cultural studies. And basically, my question is, how do we do cultural studies in this time of pandemic? So uh, what does it mean to do cultural studies in the time of pandemic, in the time of social distancing and travel restrictions because of the coronavirus outbreak? Since a lot of the people who do cultural studies go into the field, what does it mean for them to do their work now, from work at the present, and then from the past, I think, for in the past year already, that we are grounded and most of the time isolated inside our homes. So this presentation reflects on my previous work in cultural studies research in the time of pandemic. Some of the papers that I've collaborated with other scholars, particularly, at least for these three papers, I've collaborated with Dr. Ron Vilug from International Studies. Um, the ethical dilemmas that we went through, the fieldwork limitations, and of course, addressing the heightened precariousness of our respondents, because we were working with narratives and ethnographies of various kinds of migrant workers, Filipino migrant workers. So from departing, newly arrived, undocumented, retrenched, and returning. So we are particularly interested in thinking through their various states of mobilities and immobilities, and the various ways by which they can move and they cannot move. And of course, some of the ways in which they can cope with that as a community, um, as a very vulnerable community at this point, pandemic. So um, I'm thinking about I'm guessing I'm adapting Mikhail Bakhtin's idea here of a chronotope. What is the chronos and the topos, or the place and time of culture during this pandemic? So outside the kinds of culture that we consume as middle class people who have a privilege of a comfortable home isolation. So, and what is the place and time, or the chronos and the topos of cultural studies during the pandemic? So there are two concepts, or at least there are two discussions that I wanted to talk about today, that I wanted to sort of pull together in this presentation. Number one is uh, uh, the first one is the dynamics of movement and inertia, of flows and blockages, of mobility and immobility, of bodies, of money, of data, of ideas, of memes, of affects, just like what Dr. Arogas talked about earlier, and how all of these movements and non-movements affect the way we think of culture today. So when we think of the present time, what we usually uh, what we usually just think of is how we imagine our experience to be is within the experience of confinement, diba? Hindi tayo makalabas. That's why the kinds of cultural imaginaries that we tend to generate at this moment in time is that of isolation, of inertia, of non-movement, of being blocked, of being quarantined, and being isolated. But um, what I wanted to think through today in this presentation and how those non-movements are also precisely enabled by movements, by forms of mobilities. So why is mobility, why is forms of movements important for me as a researcher? Um, I'm particularly I'm particularly inspired by James Clifford's idea of traveling culture, of how cultures travel. In one of his essays, he asked, when culture makes itself at home in motion, where does the researcher stand? Where do we stand in the world that is in motion, when the culture and the things that we study are in constant and in constant motion? When culture and fields are no longer fixed, static dwellings, but are themselves transitory, dynamic, and shifting entities that has to be studied in all of its movements. So how do we track as scholars? How do we track these shifts and these itineraries and these changes? So therefore, an understanding of culture and the work in the field of culture should take into the consideration the routes as well as the roots of what we are studying. So this has been what John Urey has termed as the mobility's turn in culture, when politics, social life, and increasingly social theory have become a matter of contested mobilities and contested metaphors of the mobile life. So even the idea of even metaphor, right, is a metaphor. Even the word metaphor is a metaphor of movement. So if you look at the origin of that word, it's a word that moves from one place to another. So in that sense, mobility, it seems, is central to the way in which people live in an increasingly networked society. So how then should we understand the changes pandemic brought to the fore in a culture that is in motion? I'm always, even before the pandemic, I'm always sort of grounded by what Gayatri uh, Chakravorty Spivak have said about globalization, in that in his introduction in her book An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, he says that globalization only takes place among capital and data. Everything else is damage control. So even the bodies that move are damage control. So even the migration is sort of just a direct effect of capital's movement and mobility across borders. So here, if you can see, only capital and data and perhaps virus are the ones that can cross borders as fluidly, or the ones that do not recognize borders, stoppage. Everything else should be accounted for because they are parts of the after effects of the movements of capital data and virus. So the number of bodies, the number of beds that those bodies occupy, the number of resources that are being redirected for the sustenance of those bodies, the amount of money spent, the number of vaccine, etc., are all effects of this, or part of the damage control of uh, this globalization, or the borderlessness of capital and data, which is to say that the unregulated movement of capital has brought really our planet's comorbidities to this virus. So that is one way of framing how mobility is connected to this virus. If I follow what Spivak is saying, so but in a sense also, it is perhaps in this pandemic that we also simultaneously experience a different topos, both in both an expansion and a compression of place and of time, and in the vastness and the smallness of our own globality. So we begin to understand and to begin to recognize how big the world is, because uh, because the pandemic makes us aware of that globality, diba? When we watch the TV, when we watch the news, uh, we are always reminded of the epic proportions of this global public health emergency. So you begin to be reminded of your place in this small place in this globality, and at the same time, you also understand um, how your own place, how small your own place is. So there is also a compression there when your whole world is now reduced into this tiny little screen in, for example, in Zoom. So uh, as mentioned earlier by Tiny before the program, by Francis before the program start, we are already a year in our a year anniversary, 1 year anniversary from the moment that we first experienced the class suspensions, which would later lead into this enhanced community quarantine until what we are experiencing now is general community quarantine. So, and now we are in various versions of localized community quarantine because of the new variants. So, thinking about that, a year ago, I was also uh, teaching cultural studies, introduction to cultural studies to some of the students who I think has logged in and has joined us in this session. And I'm guessing we're both in the same questions about at that point a year ago. They're thinking of going into various kinds of fields. Some of them are thinking or have proposed papers on going into an ethnographic study of a local urban mall, a small local urban mall. Some of them have proposed to me a study of their uh, communities, cultural studies of communities uh, beside their residences. So all of those came to a halt at this point. And I'm guessing, as what Tiny have said earlier, there's a shared experience of that vulnerability. So one of the other things that we can think of is how we imagine this pandemic to be sort of uh, uh, we I think there is been thinking about how we tend to bracket things, diba? How do we tend to bracket history? And I think all of these imaginaries of pandemic being a portal is also a way of bracketing it as if there is a radical break from how we are used to. So if we go back to what Arundhati Roy is saying in her essay, she started with making us imagine how this pandemic is a sort of a door to something else. So in her essay, she started with who can use the term gone viral now without shuddering a little, who can look at anything anymore, a door handle, a cardboard carton, a bag of vegetables, without imagining it swarming with those unseeable, undead, unliving blobs dotted with suction pads waiting to fasten themselves onto our lungs. So even the idea of pandemic being a portal is seen as within this continuum of imagery of movements. So she would continues that, but unlike the flow of capital, this virus seeks proliferation, not profit, and has therefore inadvertently, to some extent, reversed the direction of flow. It has mock immigration controls, biometrics, digital surveillance, and every other kind of data analytics, and struck hardest thus far in the richest, most powerful nations, bringing the engine of capitalism to a shuddering halt temporarily perhaps, but at least long enough for us to examine its parts, make an assessment, and decide whether we want to help fix it or look for a better engine. So in this essay, Arundhati Roy argues that pandemic presents us with unparalleled opportunity to reimagine our future, and she implores us to just do that by thinking of this pandemic as an opportunity for a radical break from the business as usual. So, one of the questions that I wanted to ask, although it's certainly thought provoking to think of this as a portal, I would want to also bring it down a notch and think of it as in question if there is really a radical break from the business as usual. Did the capitalism really has stopped in the heels of the pandemic, even in its most uh, alarming rate in the richest of the countries? Did capitalism really stop, uh, kumbaga, stop long enough for us to even make an assessment, or does it still continue? So I'm thinking of whether it would be more appropriate to think of this stop not as a stop, but as just as to really define the temporariness of that stop, and to really not think too optimistically about the pandemic. It's something that would give us a portal of a radical break. Maybe pandemic is just a portalet, a portalet is just a respite or a stop to the ongoingness of this crisis that we have been thinking about. And uh, even though we are inside this portalet, we know that movements and mobilities of capital and data is still ongoing outside of that space that we are in, that we are confined with. And so basically what I'm just talking about here, in a rather winding fashion now, is I wanted to forward this idea about how mobility and immobility are both part of each other's mechanisms. Um, and it would be helpful to think about how to understand culture in this particular moment by thinking about the forces that compel us to move, and the forces that compel us to stop. So Nicole Schiller and Noel Salazar deploys this concept of regimes of mobility. But this regime of mobility is not just about mobility, but also immobility, because it also describes the roles of both the individual states and of changing international regulatory and surveillance administrations that affect individuals' mobility and immobility, while also examining the dialectics and the dynamics of both movement and stasis, and to critique the dichotomy of mobility and immobility in understanding human movements, and in my particular research, human culture. So um, I'm just going to go briefly on some of the things that I looked into as a sort of a way to understand those two opposing forces of mobility and immobility, and how it applies to my own research. Uh, when in my collaboration with Ron Villog, we looked at the idea of how it is to feel stranded at home when we interviewed retrenched and returning OFWs during lockdowns. So look, we tried to track and trace the mobility of number one, um, a retrenched Pinay seafarer who came from a cruise ship, and their cruise ship was suddenly, of course, grounded during the height of the pandemic, and she was forced to come home, and she was forced to go through all of those difficult flows of coming home, um, during, I think, at the early start of the government's repatriation program. And then we look at a, a retiree, a Pinay, returning Pinay domestic helper from Hong Kong, who went home to her hometown in the latter stages of the government's repatriation program. So we are trying to track, of course, and trying to compare very different kinds of experiences. But what 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 we find really interesting in understanding and analyzing their and examining their narratives is that how, even though they have radically very different experiences, how forces of mobility and immobility converge in even in the various stages of their coming home. And even when they are describing, for example, how they feel when they arrive at their hometowns, in the provinces, how they still feel stranded, just like what they feel, for example, when they are stuck in the sea for traveling from Florida to the Philippines to the port of Manila for several months, or they feel stuck in a shelter in Hong Kong because their ticket because they have to cancel the flights because of the various changes uh, of um, of what is happening during the pandemic. So, uh, what's interesting for us, for Ron and I, is seeing how this uh, this uh, this dynamics of mobility and immobility. And then another research that we've done is to look at, for example, how undocumented migrant workers in UK and Italy navigate the heightened precariousness of their position and experience of undocumentation in Europe during the time of pandemic. Particularly, we talk to them, and we talk to group leaders during the height of the pandemic during I think April, May last year. And what's interesting is how their precarity is exacerbated precisely by some of the pre-pandemic inequalities that already exist in Italy and UK even before the coronavirus outbreak, and also the ways in which they navigate their immobility through the help of their community. So, um, what? So at that point, I think uh, uh, this led us into trying to understand how community is formed during the pandemic, which is part of, I think, an important aspect of our research, has something to do with community and resilience. And Tiny has mentioned about the importance of having this APEC, this feeling of shared experience of vulnerability, because then in this encounter with vulnerability, in this recognition of one's vulnerability, you'll be compelled to look into the other's vulnerability and see and recognize your own with them. I think this has been the core of what's happening with another research that we've done about the multidimensionality of care in migrant communities during the height of the pandemic in Europe and in Asia. So we explored how organizations has sort of practice the and reconceptualize the work of care, the labor of care among fellow Filipinos. So we're looking at communities whose care has been commodified because they're working as either care workers or domestic workers. And what's interesting is how they are also very conscious about how care is being redefined outside capitalist notions of care, that is something that is commodified, and how they participate in building their communities through notions of solidarity and notions of caring towards each other. So in a way, they're also reformulating what care means to them, and they're also challenging this devalued concept of care that we are at this moment in time. We are finding that is really, really essential in our survival throughout this pandemic. So, on that note, I would end my presentation, and I would probably talk further about my research later on in the question and answer. So, we'll move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Dr. Anne Francis Sangil. Frances, our colleague in the department, would talk about art in the time of social distancing, social isolation, and how to teach art in the virtual classroom in the time where everyone is affected by the disruption and of the pandemic, and we are prevented from going into modes of learning that is more participatory and immersive because all of us are grounded inside our home. So Dr. Anne Frances Sangil is an associate professor in the Department of Literature, where she teaches popular culture, art appreciation, Philippine and world literature, and electives on J.K. Rowling and film and literature. She also serves as a chapter organizer for the Philippines of Hogwarts Philippines chapter for the Harry Potter Alliance, a nonprofit organization run by Harry Potter fans online. So Dr. Sangil is also a storyteller, having had experiences in storytelling sessions and workshops with Scholastic Incorporated, the Knowledge Channel, the National Bookstore, and the Department of Education. Dr. Sangil is currently has finished actually her dissertation on Filipino filmmaker Mike De Leon and author theory when she earned her PhD in literature. So, without further ado, I'm giving you Dr. Sangil.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Piocos. Uh, I hope you can all hear me and see me. Good morning. My name is Anne Frances Sangil, and I teach art appreciation or GEARTAP here virtually here right now at De La Salle University with the Department of Literature. It's been a year now since the start of the lockdown in the metro, and it's also been a year since I last set foot inside a classroom. For the record, while I do not miss the hellish commute from Bulacan to Taft and Taft to Bulacan on a daily basis, I do miss teaching in front of a chalkboard with a functioning or sometimes malfunctioning multimedia projector and 40 plus students rolling about restlessly in their seats, ready to physically and intellectually engage with the day's lesson. It has been a year of missing and hoping and social distancing. Let me share my screen. The coronavirus pandemic has brought new pedagogical challenges. We had to make immediate changes with institutions, educators, and students forced to adjust and adapt to the demands of online learning. One of the things that was severely affected by this disruption is the participatory and immersive nature of art education. Art galleries, museums, concert halls, and cinema houses have been deserted in favor of virtual galleries, streaming sites, and other online venues to fill the void. Requirements laid out at the start of the term, as well as the rubrics for assessment, had to be amended, keeping in mind the practicality, the limitations, and the mental well being of all involved. Teaching GEARTAP or GE Art Appreciation before COVID, or what I call GEARTAP BC, was a combination of many variables and assessments. Aside from the usual papers and quizzes and exams, I was very much fond of group tasks, notably debates and role playing and discussion leadership. I was also quite religious when it came to requiring students to attend the Art in Action, a program organized by the Culture and Arts Office every term, which allowed my students to experience music in a quote unquote proper venue. Visiting galleries and museums was also a staple, obliging students to have a tangible experience of the visual arts. GareTap DC, or during COVID, forced me to reassess everything. I could no longer do the usual uh, activities or bank on what used to be normal strategies for teaching art appreciation. While primary consideration was still, of course, the learning outcomes, I had to temper it with the realities brought about by the pandemic. I was aware of the difficulties my students had to deal with on top of COVID anxiety. Families struggling because of lost jobs and consequently difficulty or ultimately inability to pay their tuition fees, or not having a conducive space to learn at home, or not having a decent gadget or Wi Fi. All these things and more compete with our learning outcomes. And for an educator, having all these concerns of individual students on top of your own can be quite a nightmare. The frustration stemming from being ejected from your Zoom class 5 to 7 times within a 90-minute session because of your ghastly connectivity in the province is all too real. And even if by miracle my connectivity cooperates for a session, I end up talking to a black screen accentuated by names of disembodied students. Just to quickly share, one of the worst I experienced was last year talking to a void with 40 plus names who refused to talk or show themselves on screen. Everyone just relying on the chat box, giving me one word replies. Out of frustration, I ended up turning off my microphone and video and did my entire lecture on the chat box. Something like, here's a dose of your own medicine. See if you like it. I'm not sure if the students or if it worked for the students, that strategy, or if they felt my exasperation. But I was deep into that quicksand, one all teachers are very much aware and afraid of, the pit of despair. Suffice it to say, I never did that again. One of the activities that sort of rescued me from my pit of despair and was able to incorporate into my GearTap DC is Izoizoliatia. I chanced upon an article talking about this project, which began in Russia last year. I shared the article with my GearTap students then, second term of last academic year, and even told them I am planning on doing this for next term's fully online GearTap classes. And I even wished that it would be a success. I am now into my third term of teaching GearTap fully online, and my little jaunt with Izoizoliatia has become a staple in my plan. So, following my year long experimentation and my students' experiences in understanding and utilizing art in the middle of the pandemic, this session will illustrate the strategy of using Izoizoliatia in the virtual classroom. Think of this as me reflecting out loud how I've been utilizing this Russian project in my GERTAP classes and how my students have been responding to it. Keeping in mind the course objectives and the learning outcomes for GERTAP, I think Izoizoliatia fits in quite nicely into my plan, for through it, the objectives I set out for the term are met. The word izoizoliatia is roughly translated as art isolation, at least by many, if not all, the online articles available. But if you look at how the word, which is technically non existent, came about, it will bring you several points of illumination about the project's nature. Isolation in Russian is izolyatsiya, while the word art in Russian translates to something more complex, something which I will not dare say out loud. So you will see that the project is a portmanteau of sorts, which brings the first two syllables of the Russian word for art with the full Russian word for isolation. What you have is the izo plus izolyatsiya equals izoizolyatsiya. Now notice that the double iso articulates the spirit of this project. Iso plus isol is not just art plus isolation, but also art in twos, an original and a copy, whereby a mirroring occurs. Another point to consider is that it is art coming out of isolation, iso out of iso. That art is organically birthed by and in isolation, making one think that there is something aesthetically pleasing about isolation, or that in isolation can one find the creativity, the imagination to create, or in this sense, recreate. The project started with a few friends in Moscow looking to entertain each other as the city began enforcing self isolation rules as COVID took hold in April. Using household items, raided wardrobes, and a familiar Russian inflected sense of irony, members have produced creative remakes of everything from European masterpieces to Soviet agitprop and coronavirus influenced memes. So basically, it is a tableau with a pandemic twist. Soon, submissions were coming in from Ukraine, Georgia, Israel, Western Europe, North America, and beyond. Proof of its success is how the Isolation Project has been shortlisted in the Moscow Urban Forum Community Awards of 2020. It has also been nominated for Headliner of the Year. Its main goal, according to organizers, is to encourage leaders who created interesting and meaningful initiatives that change lives around and form the trends of tomorrow. With this in mind, how does Izoizolyatsia fare in my virtual classroom? How do the students respond to this project? This activity is something I explain to my students at the start of the term during our very first Zoom interaction. I give them more than 2 months to prepare, which is more than enough time to fulfill this particular task. That this is submitted towards the end of the term provides the students not just sufficient time to prepare, but also the time to process whatever we're discussing in class and hopefully incorporate whatever they are learning into their project. The Izoizolyatsa project is twofold. Number one, the recreation, and number two, the essay that accompanies the work. The essay part is essential for it allows the students to articulate what they have learned in the course of recreation, to share their insights about the original artwork, and more importantly, to talk about the process, how they were able to do the task while in quarantine. This last point gives my students the opportunity to engage not just with their chosen artwork, but also to reflect, understand, and process their own isolation. Take note that the Russian project does not demand a complimentary essay for submission. It's just the visuals that matter. But for my GARE tab, I believe students talking about their work, the rationale for their choices, and the manner they executed the project is essential to meeting the target outcomes for this course. As mentioned in the learning outcomes of our Gear Tap syllabus, assess and articulate their personal relationship to art and how it enhances their understanding of human existence. Because art appreciation is a personal relationship between an individual and a work of art in isolation or otherwise. Assessment. The evaluation of the student's works is a 3 point assessment. Number one, the amount of faithfulness. The izoizolyatsia must be faithful to the original, close enough for me to recognize the masterpiece being recreated using elements such as color, texture, space, lines, etc. Number two, the level of creativity and imagination in the execution. The recreation will not be able to imitate the original 100% given the limitations of the environment. This is where creativity comes in. How does a student make use of her or his creativity in achieving the original look? And number three, the level of difficulty. The more difficult and challenging the imitation, the better. Because at the end of the day, a bowl of fruits is still just a bowl of fruits. The results. So far, I have been presenting to you the creamiest of the crop from the last 2 terms I've been doing this activity. There were some misses, some so-so, but I am pleased to report that overall, I've received the most amazing examples of izoizolyatsia. Some so good, I even encourage my students to submit them in the official Izoizolyatsia online community for public dissemination and consumption. For the record, I reached out to these individuals and requested for their written consent so that their output and insights may be included in today's session. From their essays, I have gleaned the following from my students. Number one, they like how they are in control of this activity because they are given free reign to choose which artist or artwork to work on. I wanted my students to have that sort of freedom. So my restrictions were actually quite minimal. I told them they cannot do the Mona Lisa since it's too easy and it's too popular. And also that it has to be something, it has to be a painting to even out the playing field and to make sure the assessment will be standard for all. But that's about it. They are free to choose either local or foreign work from the Renaissance or contemporary, abstract or realist. The only limitation is their own imagination. Number two, they like that by the project's very nature, it has its limitations and that they actually have to work with those limitations in mind. That they do not have to purchase anything is a plus point because given the financial difficulties brought about by the lockdown, nobody wants extra expenditures for a class project. There is no photoshopping or use of the lasso tool allowed, no filter, and nothing post-production. One notable example is my students watering the flowers by Johan, the one on the left side of your screen. I liked how she was able to work around the available space in her home and make creative changes in her own work. Notice how she's also able to incorporate the spirit of the lockdown. In the original, the subject of the painting is watering the plant, giving it nourishment in the process. In her recreation, she's the one about to be nourished by the cup noodles she is preparing. Truly, in quarantine, cup noodles saves the day. That they can also utilize what they have at home. Literally, what they have in their own backyard is another plus point. So it's a matter of looking at your own space differently and perhaps with an agenda. For example, the student who worked on Amorsolo's Woman in Tobacco Field. She was stuck in the province for the duration of the lockdown. They have a field outside of their house, plus a carabao. So voila, the Amorsolo worked for her. They appreciated how this number three, they appreciated how despite the spirit of isolation embedded in the activity, that they are able to use this as an opportunity to bond with their family. Many students, in their essay narratives, recounted in detail, oftentimes amusing, how their family members helped them with their project. One student even chronicled the actual production with behind the scene photos to show how her parents and siblings all helped out, either in taking the photo or making the props, or in one case, a student's grandfather, being a real life barber, cut her hair short before the shoot in order to achieve the actual look of the subject in the original painting. It illustrated to me how, in the midst of isolation, families can still come together to achieve a goal. That in the time of social distancing, it's your immediate family that you can count on. One student who worked on Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine wrote, overall, imitating art in isolation was a challenging but rewarding experience. I couldn't possibly do it all by myself. That is why I am grateful to my family for providing a helping hand. I have learned so much about presentations of art these past few days that I believe it was able to add to my creativity. I am glad to have bonded with my family as well in a way I never knew I needed. End of quote. Or a student who worked on Samsonov's Man with the Rooster. He wrote, I saw this as a type of way for me to bond with my father as we've been busy with our businesses. He was an avid fan of Sabov, so it was decided for him to be the man with the rooster. End of quote. Also, take note how the student was able to incorporate the spirit of the pandemic, utilizing the Lysol canister and rubbing alcohol in the foreground and even in the background of his recreation. Number four, the project also allowed the students to reflect on their choice and to have a meaningful engagement with it in the course of their recreation. One student who worked on The Milkmaid by Vermeer wrote how he was reminded of his mother's hard work for their family of seven during this pandemic. He wrote, she reminded me of my mom in such a way that she too exemplified the values of dedication, courage, and hard work in cooking and working for the family. My mom has had to cook for the entire family alongside work during the day, and I've never heard her complain even once. Whenever she starts preparing to cook, I always make it a point to help her in any way, and it has now become a bonding experience for the both of us. So I wanted to commemorate that through imitating this painting. I chose to imitate this painting as a way of showing my appreciation for all the sacrifices she's made, not only for me, but for the entire family. End of quote. And finally, number five, this activity gave my students an opportunity to voice out their sentiments, to showcase an advocacy that they have. A student who worked on Manansala's Madonna of the Slums wrote how this particular work, and I quote, hits close to home, as I'm an activist who works closely with the urban poor through the mass organization that I'm a part of. I wanted to show the theme presented by Manansala through my eyes as an activist who often deals with similar people who experience the same hardships as the subjects depicted in the painting. This does not in any mean connote the romanticizing of the urban poor situation. Instead, it is an eye opener for people that there remains this rampant situation of these marginalized people that suffers the anti poor, fascist, and biased policies by the state who treats them as liabilities. As you see the blue skies and rest of the comfort of your own bed, I hope you remember the grace in the slum, the black in the daylight, the salt of drained tongues, and the rumbling of stomachs, all of which are etched in the live recreation of the artwork. In the end, we see that every work of art starts out with either a story, an inspiration, or a vision in mind. Each creation holds meanings that could be unraveled by the audiences from different generations. All in all, the power of art in conveying messages to each individual, regardless of the artist's intention, can inflict a sense of self reflection that can turn into social action. End of quote. Beautiful, right? 4.0. Final thoughts. Isoizolyatsia, well, literally, is art isolation, is a variant form of art. It is the art of making do. It is a matter of adaptation, of trickery, of coaching as a matter of survival in this time of pandemic. It allows us to constantly find meanings and relevances amidst the isolation, to still engage even in quarantine, a quarantine engagement, if you will. Meanings are recreated to fit the effects of the pandemic. Art once again highlights its power, not just in its sense of originality, which is ironic since art is meant to be a reflection, if not imitation or a copy of what is real, but also in its sense of multiplicability or reproducibility. And not just a simple reproduction, but reproduction by trickery, what I call a simulation with a heaping of smart assery. While it may recall Duchamp's ready-mades and parodies, what is different is the self-insert. The recreator is not just that, a recreator, but can also be an active participant in the simulation, a subject of the art. This self-insert illustrates the recreator's active engagement by being part of a landscape, of a historical event, or of an imagined world, thereby reimagining the said landscape, historical event, or fantastic world. The artist is not absent. The student is not a mere spectator in the experience, but has become part of the creation. And hopefully, art will aid the learner in processing emotions such as fear or depression, anxiety, given the isolation, and even anger, and help in what Dr. Tiny Arogo said earlier in this transition to action. The teaching of art appreciation in the middle of a pandemic must not result to a pedagogical paralysis. Educators and learners are challenged further to explore art and our relationship with it, despite the lack of the usual material resources, institutions, and even travel opportunities. The demand to socially distance, to remove ourselves from places and from people, lead us to art without the usual feast, without the lining up and the bag checking, minus the performative display of our interested selves and bodies in an actual museum. Truly, and with some changes and lots of apologies to Walter Benjamin, we find the work of art in the age of not mechanical but digital reproduction. The aura of teaching and consuming art has long decayed, and the accompanying ritual is not practiced, at least not now, not in the time of pandemic. This is how we articulate our resilience as art educators. National artist for film, Kidlat Tahimik, in his keynote last Monday said that resilience is not just pagiging matatag in these difficult times. It's adaptability. It's pag-uugnay sa sitwasyon, he said. And I think Izoy Zoliatzia illustrates just that, our ability to engage with a pandemic, the situation, and how we can utilize it to our own advantage. That we are able to take back control from COVID and still engage with art and figure out ways how to still find its relevance in our lives and in our teaching, despite the current challenges speak of our potential sa ating kakayahan sa pag-uugnay sa sitwasyon. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Frances, for that wonderful presentation. Very interesting outputs from students. Galing, galing. Before we move on to our last presenter for today, I would want you to, for those of you who have questions, just log into slido.com and then use the code 65353 to post your questions because we are receiving questions from there. Just a reminder. So if you have any questions, please post your questions there. I've put the, Reniel is um, showing us the link and I will also posted the instructions in our chat box. Okay, thank you very much, Reniel. So our last presentation is about queer LGBT culture during the time of the pandemic. And in this presentation, Dr. Espiritu will be using the idea of confinement of the closet and in the new normal, and what does it mean to look through queer culture in the time of our new normal. So, Dr. Johan Vladimir Espiritu from our department teaches literature, art appreciation, and gender and sexuality studies. His pedagogical and research interests include creative writing, feminist, gender, and queer studies, cultural studies, and popular culture, among others. He has published short stories and poems in Filipino and has worked as assistant director for the film volume of the CCP Encyclopedia of Philippine Art and as a managing editor for IDEA, Journal of the Humanities. So, Dr. Espiritu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piocos, for the introduction. Magandang umaga po sa lahat ng ating mga tagapanood sa panel na ito ng 14th DLSU Arts Congress. Diyos ko, paano mo ba naman susundan yung tatlong napaka-outstanding no, na lectures no, ng aking mga kasamahan sa department. No? I can only wish to imitate no, yung yung kanilang husay sa kanilang sa kani-kanila nilang mga lectures. Siguro maliit na anecdote lang bago ko simulan yung aking maikling lecture, no. Kasi basically ang nag-inspire nito, apart from my dissertation which I finished a few years back, was the fact that these last several days, I have been quite addicted to this app, which a lot of the students here now may probably be familiar with. And this app is called Kumu. Okay, it's a Pinoy streaming platform uh, kung saan ang mga performing artists ay maaaring mag-stream ng content nila regularly. Pwede silang mag-gather ng audience, no, and along with those audiences, pwede silang mangolekta ng tinatawag na virtual gifts, or yung in the Kumu community it's called diamonds. And then kapag napalago nila, na parami nila yung kanilang diamonds, they may either use these to purchase gifts for other streamers, or in order to convert to cash. So kung sikat ka, no, may malaki kang following, at magaling kang mambudol, so to speak, ng audience mo sa panghihingi ng diamonds, pwede ka actually kumita sa Kumu. In fact, madaming mga independent artists na ginagamit itong platform na to bilang hanap buhay, especially because of the effects of the pandemic on their original jobs, no. Kaya ko kinukwento ito ay dahil naging ugali ko na gabi-gabi. In fact, no, sa pag-ease ng aking insomnia gabi-gabi, mga around 1 or 2 a.m., naging ugali ko na yung mag-ikot-ikot kumbaga sa Kumu. At napansin ko na meron ako palaging nadadaan ng profile where there are multi slots, no. I think 5 o 6 sila na maliliit na boxes na they stream their content. They and then may meron silang maliit na audience, no. Mga bakla itong mga nasa boxes na ito. So naka-cross-dress sila, no. At talagang fully made up, no, na talagang yung iba halos by drag standards yung kanilang itsura, no. Talaga kumbaga career na career. And then napapansin ko kapag tinignan mo yung ibang profile sa Kumu, you know, the likes of singers like for instance Katrina Velarde, no, or even Jaya, the Queen of Soul, no, makikita mo na millions of diamonds yung naiipon nila sa bawat isa o 2 oras na pag-stream ng pagkanta. Whereas itong particular profile na ito ng mga matatandang bakla, no, may mga edad na sila, no, makikita mo through their sagging cheeks, no, and yung drooping eyelids, no. I'd say probably the youngest of them is in their is in their early 50s, no, and then the oldest probably is in his mid 60s, ganyan. Halos walang nagbibigay ng virtual gifts, halos wala silang diamonds, laging zero. Minsan naabutan ko may 200 diamonds, tapos pag tinignan mo ilang oras na silang nagsi-stream. So kapag naiisip ko kung gaano katagal yung oras at gaano kalaki yung effort na iginugol nila sa pag-aayos, sa pag-impersonate, sa pagtanggap ng requests na kanta, sa pagkanta, parang sabi ko hindi fair, hindi nila deserve yung ganitong kakaunting diamonds, no, from the audience. Samantalang ang dami-dami dito na, for example, no, may itsura lang, wala naman talent sa pagkanta, kanta ng kanta, ang daming diamonds. Hindi ko na banggitin yung pangalan ng mga may itsura na yon, ano. Pero ito basically yung nag-udyok sa akin na pag-isipan ang lugar ng bakla sa pandemya and under certain levels of lockdown, no, and the quarantine that has been going on for a year, for exactly a year. So it's just basically going to be a rambling of sorts, no, a thinking aloud moment. um, I will be talking about OPM music, a little of OPM music, although unfortunately we won't have any more time to actually listen to the songs that I will probably be mentioning here. So babanggitin ko na lang yung titles nila. And during your own time, I know all of my students probably are here na maaari ko sigurong ulitin sa ating kanya-kanyang mga klase, no, yung titles nitong mga kantang ito, so you can listen to them during your own time. So the title of this work is Musika at Kabaklaan sa Panahon ng Pandemya. So hayaan ninyo na simulan ko na. Maliit at maikling espasyo lamang ito sa panel na ito na dumidiskurso sa sining at humanidades sa panahon ng pandemya. Isang espasyo ng pag-iisip, pamamanukala at paglikha ng mga koneksyon sa mga aspeto ng buhay na nagdurugtong o naghihiwalay sa pamamagitan ng kinahaharap nating pandemya. Tatlong termino na kailangan kong linawin bago magpatuloy. Isang mabilis na pagbubuod. Ang sex ay biological na salik ng ating identity. Male o female. Depende sa aring panlabas at sa lamang loob na reproductive. Samantalang ang gender ay social at personal. Kung ano ka sa sarili mong tingin. Paano mo tinitingnan lang yung sarili at paano ka tinitingnan ng lipunan mo. Ikaw ba ay isang man o woman? Ikaw ba ay cisgender or non-binary? Wala ito masyadong kinalaman sa ari, kundi sa pakiramdam. Paano natin binubuo at itinataguyod ang ating mga sarili base o hindi base sa standards ng ating paligid at ng ating mga sarili mismo. Samantalang pangatlo, ang sexuality ay nakabase sa desire, pagnanasa. Sino ang gusto mo? At ano ang kanyang sex? Ikaw ba ay isang homosexual? Parehong sex? No? Heterosexual? Lalaki at babae? Bisexual? Gusto mo ba ang parehong babae at lalaki? Pansexual? Gusto mo ba ang lahat ng uri ng kasarian, babae at lalaki, at ang lahat ng uri ng gender identity rin? O iba pa? Sa kabilang banda, maikling buod din ng dalawang karagdagang termino na nakakabit sa pagiging hindi heterosexual. Lalo na dito sa Pilipinas dahil sa tingin ko ay matindi ang halaga rin ito sa thinking aloud ko ngayong umaga. Ang tinatawag na homosexual ay uri ng sexuality. It pertains to one's sex object choice or for that matter, ang pagkakagusto at pagnanasa sa kaparehong sex. Wala itong kinalaman sa itsura, sa bihis, sa galaw, sa asta, sa pagiging astig, sa pagiging malamya at iba pa. At ganito rin ang pagbubuod ng tanyag na gay critic na si J. Neil Garcia sa libro niyang Philippine Gay Culture. Marami kasi ang nagsasabi na iisa lang ang homosexual o kaya ay gay sa mas ordinaryong katawagan at ang bakla. At hindi tama ang assumption na ito. Kasi habang ang sexuality ay pagiging, or rather, habang ang pagiging homosexual ay isang sexuality, ang pagiging bakla naman ay isang gender identity. Lalaki rin ang gusto ng bakla. Kaya kung tutuusin, kung iisipin, homosexual nga siya. Pero ang bakla ay kailangan malamya, malambot magsalita, pumipilantik ang mga daliri, may bahid, sabi ko na, Barbie. Yung iba mukhang lalaki lang pero paminta. Kapag nilapitan ng flying ipis, titili. pasok sa stereotype ng lalaking babae ang kalooban pero di kailanman magiging tunay na babae. Kaya mas specific sa kultura natin sa Pilipinas ang identity ng bakla. Kasi may sariling philosophy ang pag-intindi natin sa pagkatao niya at maging ang pag-intindi niya sa sarili. Dahil dito, mas specific din ang dinaranas niyang oppression mula sa kultura nating patriarkal. At ito ang isa sa mga pinaka-importanting kaibahan sa pagitan ng bakla at ng gay o ng homosexual. Ngayon, nailatag ko na ang dapat ilatag, isusunod ko naman ang paglalahad ng paglaladlad ng bakla sa pamamagitan ng original Pinoy music nitong huling 4 na dekada. Pero hindi comprehensive ito guys kasi 15 to 20 minutes lang ang meron ako. So highly severely in fact even summarize na din ito para madali nating matumbok ang punto at mas lalo pa nating mapag-isipan kung kumusta na kaya ang bakla sa mga panahong ito. Nang isulat ko ang PhD dissertation ko 4 years ago, binagtas ko ang karamihan sa mga kantang Pilipino na tungkol sa bakla. Whether nagbabanggit ng bakla, galing sa bakla, para sa bakla, basta may bakla, no? Na English song by a Filipino artist, no? Or a song written in Filipino, no? Pasok yan sa banga. Nang lumaon, napansin ko, maaaring hatiin sa 4 na kategorya ang 18 kantang nakalap ko nitong huling 4 na dekada. At ang 4 na kategorya na ito ay una, mga kantang nagpapakita ng contrast sa pagitan ng pagiging bakla at ng pagiging tunay na lalaki. Or usually, ang ina-assume na heterosexual, masculine men. Pangalawa, mga kantang nagkukwento ng paglaladlad o coming out ng persona o ng tinig ng kanta. Pangatlo, mga kantang nagkukwento ng mga kantang nag-e-explore ng pagkakaibigan at pagkakaibigan sa pagitan ng lalaki at ng kapwa lalaki. At pang-apat, mga kantang nagpapakita ng pagkakahawig, ng contrast, at ng ironies or contradictions sa pagitan ng bakla at ng babae. Ngayon, sa 18 kantang yon, 6 lang ang masasabi ko na galing sa bakla. And when I say galing, pinerform ng bakla. At kapag sinabi nating pinerform ng bakla, ibig sabihin yung bakla na out, yung wala nang itatago pa. In fact, doon sa 6 na yon, 2 lang yung kanta ng isang bakla na kumpirmadong naglabas ng statement in one way or another na bakla siya. Kasi yung 4 na natitirang kanta, although lantarang bakla sa paningin at pandinig natin yung nag-perform, never silang nagkaroon ng any documentation, whether by video or audio, na nag-confirm sila ng kanilang identity. Okay? Ang mga kantang ito, yung 4 na sinasabi ko ay mula sa grupo na sumikat ng 80s at ang tawag sa kanila ay Charing. Ang titles ng kantang ito, ng mga kanta ay Wala na bang lalaki? Number 1. Number 2, La 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 Lalaki. 4 na la. No? La 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 Lalaki. Badaf Forever at Ikukubli ba o Ilaladlad na. So yun yung 4 na titles. Samantalang yung 2 natitira ay parehong pinerform ni Alan Kay, sikat na komedyante at host sa Eat Bulaga. Ang titles ng mga kantang ito ay Ang Boyfriend Kong Bading, number 1, and number 2, Magladlad Ka. Ang isa, doon sa 18 songs, kinanta naman ng isang babae. The title is Babae Po Ako by Tuesday Vargas. And the rest were all from men who were presumably straight. The operative word here is presumably dahil wala namang interview or sitwasyon kung saan sila nag-come out o umamin na hindi sila straight. At syempre alam nating lahat na pagdating sa etika ng kasarian ay, by default, everyone is usually assumed to be straight until they come out. Nakita ko ito bilang problema. Progressive man ang nilalaman ng marami sa mga pop songs na ito, patuloy na lumulutang ang isang malaking tanong. Bakit hanggang ngayon ay wala pa rin masyadong espasyo, maliban sa ating imahinasyon, ang baklang bakla? O ang aktor halimbawa sa isang series na gumaganap na bakla? O ang singer ng lalaki, no? Ang singer na lalaki sa kanta na nagkukunwaring bakla. No? Bakit sa mga tekstong ito, mapapelikula, mapaawit, no? At iba pa, na lalong laganap ngayon bilang alternatibong mundo sa panahong nagiging normal ang hindi normal, ay uso pa rin ang pagbabakla-baklaan sa sarili nating mga anyo ng sining at pagtatanghal. Sa dalawa, sa pinaka-recent na kanta sa proyektong nabanggit ko kanina, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these songs, both performed by Michael Pangilinan, titled Pare, Mahal Mo Raw Ako at Pare, Mahal Naman Kita. May pag-asa si Pare sa kanta. Si Pare yung baklang addressee ng kanta. Iisipin pa nga na baka nga straight si kuyang persona dun sa unang kanta, Pare, Mahal Mo Raw Ako. Kasi sabi niya, and I quote the lyrics here, at kung higit pa dun, pasensya na, di ko makakaya. Pare, kaibigan lang kita. Hindi niya kaya, di ba? Hindi nilinaw kung bakit kaya maluwag at mapagbigay ang posibilidad. Kasi kung hindi siya bakla, hindi niya kaya dahil wala siyang desire sa kapwa niya lalaki. At kung bakla naman siya, hindi niya kaya dahil hindi siya out. Takot siguro siyang mahusgahan ng pamilya, ng paligid o ng mga kaibigan niya. Vague man din ang pangalawang kanta na sequel nito, the title is Pare, Mahal Naman Kita, ay mas nagkaroon ng linaw ang pagkatao ni Kuya doon. Sa Pare, Mahal Naman Kita, sabi niya, I quote, Pare, mahal naman kita, pero ako'y nangangamba. Kung ipipilit lang ang nais mo, baka meron lang mag-iba. Hanggang kaibigan lang ang alay ko sa'yo, pero mahal naman kita, o pare ko. Well, boses binata rito, si Michael P. Well, lagi naman siyang boses binata, no? Boses pogi. May timbring nasa gitna ng malalim at matinis na tinig ng lalaki. Katamtaman yung tunog niya. Fragile, malamyos, pero steady at contemporary. May kulot, may hagod, may tamang-tamang vibrato at may emotive appeal. Very telling of a kind of image ng lalaking kanasa-nasa. Siyempre, marami sa atin nakaka-relate kay parang addressee, no? Si bakla. Gets. Nakaka-crush nga yung boses, no? Yung tono, yung sentiment. At ipinakita man sa kantang ito na homosexual nga yata ang persona. And mind you, not bakla, but homosexual. Because he sounds, at least, no, masculine. Ay wala na tayong mahihitapang dahilan sa pagiging not available niya, maliban sa linyang baka meron lang mag-iba. Takot, takot pa rin ba siya sa judgment ng ibang tao? Takot ma-label na bakla? Takot kumpirmahin sa sarili na lalaki rin ang gusto niya? Or shall we go with the classic reason, takot masira ang friendship? Napaisip ako sa pagkaka-trace ko ng tradisyon ng musikang tagabuo ng pagkatao at pagkasariling bakla sa bansa nang balikan ko ang dalawang awit na ito sa panahon ng pandemya. Kumusta na kaya ang mga bakla na katulad ng addressee sa mga kanta ni Michael Pangilinan? Yung mga sa tingin ko, yung mga hanggang tingin lang kay crush. At sa inuman lang kayang umamin dahil either torpe siya o paminta sila kapag hindi lasing. Hindi na nila masyadong nakikita ngayon si crush. Pupusta ako. Hanggang stalk na lang sa Facebook ang kaya nilang gawin. Or well, Instagram probably for more revealing photos. Idagdag pa rito ang kani-kanila nilang dilema sa kani-kanila nilang mga bahay. Ano man ang antas ng pagkakalantad nila ng sarili sa tunay at normal na mundo, the pandemic has most likely driven them backwards quite a number of steps. Isang atras papunta sa bahay, ang kloseta, ng pisikal na kaanyo ang hindi na muna maaaring maglakwatsa dahil sa virus o virus, sabi ng iba dyan. Pangalawang atras patungo sa silid. Kung meron man silang personal na silid, ang klosetang naglalaman ng bahagyang kalayaan sa pamamagitan ng paglalak ng pinto para pakawalan ang nakalukob na hininga. Pangatlong atras, patungong sarili, o ang muli o di kaya'y patuloy na pagtutupi ng nailatag o ilalatag pa lang sanang train ng kanilang metaphorical gown. Kasi hindi pa pwede, hindi na pwede, at hindi pwede sa ngayon. Inaanyayahan ko ngayon ang mga nanonood at nakikinig na bigyan ng espasyo sa kanilang mga kamalayan ang bakla sa panahon ng pandemya at iba't ibang level ng lockdown at quarantine. Kamusta na ba sila? May kanta siya, pero hindi galing sa kanya. May pelikula at TV show siya, lalo't ngayong usong-usong mga BL series, ano? Pero usually, hindi galing sa kanya. Hindi katulad niya ang aktor. May espasyo siya, pero hindi kanya. Dahil sa ngayon, ang masasabi kong maaaring isipin na kanya lang ay ang kanyang sarili at hindi natin ito lubusang maabot sa ngayon dahil nakalagay lang ang sariling ito sa apat na sulok ng isa pang kloseta sa internet na tinatawag nating Zoom o Google Meet o Facebook video chat o ang kani-kanila nilang mga Facebook profiles o ang kani-kanila nilang mga slots sa Kumu at iba pa. Baka naman maaari nating balikan ng bakla at ang pangako ng kabutihan at kapantayan, tignan kung nasaan sa iba't ibang moda ng produksyong nagpapahayag na maaari nating makita ang pamamayagpag niya. At kung hindi man kayang makalikha ng isang himala sa panahong ito, baka naman pwede nating ulit-ulitin, palawakin, paalingaw-ngawin ang tanong, kailan ulit kakanta si bakla? Kasi namamayagpag na sa media ang imahen niya. Hitik na hitik sa kabaklaan ang kasalukuyang ingay ng bansa sa telebisyon, sa memes, sa Twitter, at maging sa wikang kolokyal. Sana naman makahabol si bakla. Yun lamang. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat, Johan. At very fitting close, 'di ba, sa mga presentasyon para sa ngayong hapon. So, I was told by the angel that we only have a few minutes before we go into the next plenary kasi by 11 daw may plenary na. So, we'll probably address some few questions. We have some of them in Slido. Frances, have you seen the questions? Most of all of them are addressed to you, so probably
no.
ikaw na yung mamili yung ikaw na mamili kung anong sasagutin.
I think there's one about wait, let me go back to that particular question. Teka. All right. How can we learners appreciate more the art forms? And I feel that it's lost the aura when it's translated into a photo video. But that's the thing, no? Appreciation or this is just me talking, appreciation or valuation of art has long been dependent on that aura. No, that something that's created in the past, its position in history, kaya may cult value na lang siya. So when you go to the Louvre Museum, you look at the Mona Lisa, is it really the appreciation of the painting or the pagtatanghal, no? Nandun ka, nagbayad ka ng ticket, kumakain ka ng masarap na pagkain bago ka pumasok sa Louvre Museum. So it's the performativity, it's the ritual of going to the Louvre and appreciating, parang naging, okay, and then I will check out the Mona Lisa. But because of the decay of the aura that the questioner rightfully said, again, with apologies to Walter Benjamin, because of that, the destruction or the decay of the aura, it emancipates the work of art from its, and I quote, parasitical dependence on ritual. So it's democratizing, right? So everyone can appreciate art, make fun with it without having to pay so much. Na hindi lang yung 1% yung makaka-appreciate ng mga works of art na ito, dahil kahit sino po pwedeng hindi lang mag-appreciate kundi makialam. And I think that's the trickery involved in the appreciation of the artwork. So thank you for that question.
Salamat. Do we have we still have a minute, so it's either we have phone in questions or we can end. Yeah. So yeah, we should end here as
All
Rangela's
right. Yes,
very
sir. Thank
subtly message me. So
I think if there are a lot of questions still no, maybe you can tell the audience, we can tell our audience to post their questions on the comment section of the DLSU Arts Congress official FB
Yeah.
page, where this session is being also live streamed. No, okay. So, sir, thank you so much, Dr. Piocos, and we really learned a lot in this plenary session. And before we end, I would like to invite everyone to participate in the remaining activities of the 14th DLSU Arts Congress. At 11 a.m., there's another plenary session that talks about the interdisciplinary dialogue on the COVID-19 pandemic perspective from DLSU research centers. And at 12:45 p.m., the pre-recorded parallel session 3 videos will be available on YouTube. And with that, we now end this morning's plenary session. We would like to thank our speakers for today, Dr. Piocos, namely Dr. Antonette Arogo, Dr. Johan Vladimir Espiritu, and Dr. Anne Francis Sangil. Many thanks to
Thank
you
salamat,
you.
in this
salamat.
morning session, Arts and Humanities amid virulent times. Before you leave, can we take a photo up in this session?
This
All right. I am asking for our participants to take a photo. Turn on your cameras. Okay. There. I see beautiful faces. Great. Okay. So let me take this. Okay. In 3, 2, 1. Pose. Another one. Um, wait. Okay. Another.
Kapit, Rainiel. Ano nangyari kay Rainiel? Ayan.
I am your host for today, Mr. Mark
Ayan.
Malala from Communication Department, Animal Lasak. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very
maraming
much.
salamat.
Thank
Maraming salamat.
you.
Hello po, stop ko na po yung streaming para makapasok po tayo sa next plenary. Salamat po.